New South Wales Housing Minister Rose Jackson has come under fire for claiming in an ABC radio interview that renting a two-bedroom apartment in Sydney costs just a couple of $100.
What do you reckon is a reasonable price to pay in rent for a two-bedroom flat in Sydney?
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of depends where in Sydney. I mean, Sydney's a big city. I mean, a couple of $100, right?
Where can you get a two-bedroom flat for a couple of $100?
Well, a week, I don't know. There are places in Sydney you can. I mean, there's a two-bedroom flat and there's a two-bedroom flat. Like, not all flats are the same.
According to the Tenants Union of New South Wales, just 23 of the around 25,000 two-bedroom apartments rented out in the Greater Sydney area since July were priced at $200 a week or less. And the latest rental data shows that the median rental price for a unit in Sydney from June to September was $720 a week. The minister has since taken to social media to explain her gaffe.
Look, live radio is a hard format. You're on the phone, you can't see the other person. Sometimes you get a bit garbled, sometimes your words get a bit mangled.
Seriously, joining me now is Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Dan Wild. Dan, how can she be that clueless? I don't think there's hardly anyone in the country, regardless of where they live in Australia, who would be in any doubt about how expensive property is in Sydney to buy or to rent. To have a housing minister from New South Wales think that you can get a two-bedroom apartment for perhaps a couple of $100, just completely divorced from reality.
Well, it is. It was a shocker. And, the cover-up was actually worse than the crime, as it often is. I mean, she's a senior politician, a cabinet minister with the housing portfolio, one of the most consequential portfolios. It touches the lives of every single person in her state. And then to say, it's, doing radio interviews is hard and, so forth. Well, that's sort of your job,
Yeah.
is to be able to communicate those things to the public. So I don't understand why she would say that. Look, it just gets to this point that whether it's in New South Wales, whether it's at the federal level, housing ministers just don't have a clue about what is happening in the day-to-day lives of Australians. I mean, the housing crisis has continued now for a few years because of unplanned mass migration, which is cranking up the demand. And at the state level, we've got all of these restrictions on the development of housing, particularly urban growth, with the red tape and the cost of doing that, climate policies as well, which add to the cost, and green tape. So, look, I think Australians would expect a lot better from their political leaders
and black
to have a
tape,
basic
Dan.
understanding of what's happening. Well, there's lots of issues there, Rita, and you might not know the exact cost of rentals to the exact dollar, but to say it's $200 a week in Sydney, I mean, how far detached from reality can you be?
It's incredible. It was just so far out. I don't like those gotcha questions necessarily for politicians, like how much is a loaf of bread or a litre of milk. I think for them to know that exactly or not is not a huge issue, but to be that completely wrong, it would be like a politician saying a loaf of bread is 10 cents. It's like that divorce from reality. Now let's go to Federal Education Minister Jason Clare. He's been opining about the war between Israel and Hamas, and I think he was quite proud of this line because he posted it himself to X, formerly Twitter.
You can't bomb your way to peace. I think the last 12 months have shown us that.
He also tweeted that you can't bomb your way to peace. Dan, he seems to have a profound ignorance of how World War II ended and many other conflicts. Often that is what happens in war.
Well, that's right. I mean, he should stick to his knitting. The fact that you've got an education minister that doesn't understand history, I think tells you everything you need to know about the problems in our education system more generally. Peace through strength is what defeated the Soviet Union. That was the Reagan-Thatcher doctrine. Trump is going to, go in that direction as well in terms of trying to, show our adversaries overseas that, we've got a serious arsenal of military capabilities. And if we need to use it, we will. That is how you go about these things. The reality is that Jason Clare is only saying this, as we know, because he's his seat is in Western Sydney, and he's under pressure because of the large constituency of Muslims that are in his seat. And this is something that's been driving Labor Party policy, which has been enormously disappointing when it comes to the Middle East. So, the Education Minister should really stick to his knitting and stick to his patch, because he's got this one badly wrong. And it shows just how out of touch he is with reality and with history, as you rightly point out.
Victoria University has released the findings of a study about the psychology behind men's meat consumption. You're going to love this, Dan. Apparently, the academics think men eat red meat for masculinity and sexual prowess. This was led by a psychology lecturer. It wasn't led by a scientist. But this lecturer and his team apparently concluded that men don't want to give up red meat because it would be the equivalent of giving up their masculinity, even though they claim here that consuming meat is slowly killing men. The Victorian Uni researchers here are making all sorts of claims. It seems to be highly ideological. Dan, I'd love your considered take on this research.
Well, I'm happy to undertake a very detailed study tour of red meat around Australia and report back. I'd be happy to do that. Look, I eat red meat because it tastes good, and Australia's got the best meat in the world with our farmers. So, this is just another example of these activists that just are out of touch and they don't get it. The reality is that it's not just men that eat red meat as well, by the way. I mean, women eat red meat. I don't understand where this idea came from that it's only for men and it's an expression of masculinity. I mean, people have been eating red meat since time immemorial. Only now has it apparently become an issue. So, we know there's this activist class that seeks to link anything they don't like either to climate change or to toxic masculinity, and this is yet another example. But look, I'm going to keep eating red meat. Don't worry about that. And I think most Australians have common sense, and they'll go about their habits as they wish, not paying attention to these, unelected activists.
And the experts I listen to say we should all be eating more red meat. We should be eating more protein, and it keeps us young and healthy. Now let's take a look at this picture from yesterday's UFC event. It's President-elect Donald Trump. You can see there the world's richest man, Elon Musk, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK Jr. This was at Madison Square Garden for UFC 309. I'll be talking to Alex Stein about this event a little bit later, but have a look at that picture, Dan, and marvel at the fact that every single person there was a former Democrat. This political realignment that we are seeing in America is extraordinary. We're seeing signs of it here, not just signs. I would say the last 3 elections, there's been clear evidence of it. We've seen it in the UK. And it's stunning to see these people who are going to be making up Trump's administration were all once part of the Democrats' tent.
Well, that's right, Rita. I mean, the Republican Party is now the National Unity Party. They've got people on all sides of politics that are in their administration. And it's amazing that Trump has been the one that has actually brought, or is now starting to bring the country together with, as you say, former Democrats having key roles, or Democrat voters and supporters having key roles in his administration. This is the realignment, which is those who used to be Democrats, and you could probably put Joe Rogan in that camp as well, or at least someone who was on the left and said, well, I was on the left because I support free speech and civil liberties and so forth. But then they lived through COVID, they lived through the lockdowns. They saw what happened in California, a Democrat state, and in New York, a Democrat state. They went the furthest in imposing lockdowns and curfews and mandates on their citizens. And so that's driven a lot of this, particularly when you talk about RFK Jr. and his concerns about health and the medical bureaucracy and so forth. So, look, we're living through a fascinating time, but through a time of immense opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity to make our societies better. You mentioned the UK and Australia. So we've got a way to go in Australia, but I'm very positive about what the future brings.